Welcome. This is the second to the last lecture on Jefferson. We'll do the last one next week. We had been talking about the slave trade and how it was ending. The Constitution said you could have slave trade until 1808, and then it would have to be renewed. And we're now at a position here where we're going to talk about the bill to deal with slave trade. There we go. So the stopping of the slave trade required a bill, and they were starting to work on this in 1807, the year before the Constitution requirement ran out that guaranteed the slave trade could exist. And to stop the slave trade from Africa into the United States was introduced by a Massachusetts Congressman, Joseph Varnum. So he was from a northern state. His hope was, and many others also, was that by ending the slave trade, you would also end slavery. That was a false hope. There was a fat chance of it happening. Slavery went on for nearly another 60 years, 57 years or so. After effects of the slave trade. Well, there was a drop in the black population. Blacks were not being imported into the United States anymore. When the slave trade ended in 1808, the U.S. population was at 20% African ancestry people. In 2020, it's at 12.5%. Of course, immigration increased dramatically from European countries. So why the drop? Immigration, 1865 to 1924 in particular, from the end of the Civil War until the passage of an anti-immigration bill in 1924. In that period of time, American industries were in great need of lots of employees, and consequently lots of slavery had been outlawed. Consequently, lots of immigration was needed from Europe. That ended in 1924. We went to a quota system, and we no longer needed massive immigrants for industry. So that came to an end. And IQ tests had started in 1906, and they based immigration quotas on how well immigrants from those countries scored. Well, immigrants from Northern Europe came very early on and were well settled in the United States, whereas Southern European countries came later and had more difficulty taking the tests. Consequently, we said, okay, you can have literally, this is true, 100,000 people can come from Denmark and Germany, but you can only have 10,000 from Italy, Spain, for instance. There was a huge bias against Asians, where some countries could allow in 100 people. Illegal slave imports began as a result. Now the slave trade has stopped, but people are still going to bring it in because it's a profitable thing. You go pick up slaves in Africa, bring them to the United States, and then sell them at auctions. Over the next roughly 50 years of the slave trade being outlawed, about 50,000 slaves were brought into the United States without or illegally. That's about 10,000 in a decade. That's 1,000 in a year. That's about 3 every day. So the slave trade increased, but the one of the situations that occurred was the introduction of a lot more cotton growing in the United States. And this was a very labor-intensive industry. I mean, it had to be hand-picked. Little batches like this had to be hand-picked individually. You couldn't have some big tractor rolling along and cutting all this down. And so it took lots of slaves. There were calls in the 1850s as a result for reopening the slave trade. Now, another thing that was labor intensive with cotton early on in the 1700s was picking the seeds out of the cotton. And the cotton gin was invented in the late 1700s. That improved that, but it was still a hand grinding machine. So it did require a good bit of labor. And it was the big plantations in the United States, such as Thomas Jefferson, who owned 600 slaves. It was these people that stopped the slave trade, wanted it ended. They stopped it because they could then sell their slaves more easily. The South said, well, we'll legally bring in more slaves, but under a different category. So they said, we're going to call them apprentices, but that approach did not succeed. Thomas Jefferson's presidency, 1801 to 1809, we're going to talk about economics. Jefferson wanted no government-run banks. The United States did have a bank. It was owned by the U.S. government. He wanted the U.S. government to be rid of that. And he went further. He said, I want the federal government to take out no loans from privately held banks even. He didn't want the federal government funded at all. Of course, his concern was a strong federal government could mean the end to slavery. Had two opinions about these loans. One, it's going to lead to monopolies. Unregulated capitalism does this also, and we've had periods where capitalism was far less regulated, such as from the end of the Civil War up until 1900. And it was in 1901 when Teddy Roosevelt became president that he began to get legislation passed that regulated industries. Today, since Gerald Ford, in part, then Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, since that period of time, we've seen a tremendous decline in regulated capitalism or simply ignoring laws about capitalism, the regulations on capitalism. Now, it's going to lead to a bunch of monopolies. Well, look what has happened here in the latter half of the 20th century and up to today. Gasoline, now, monopoly means one, but it really isn't just one. I mean, if you've got just a few companies that control a market, they can talk to each other very easily, and it's really generally called monopoly. So gasoline, there's 5 companies in the United States that control 90% of all the gasoline that is refined and sold. Car rentals, there's 3 companies, Enterprise, Avis, and Hertz. Retail, warehouse clubs, Walmart is responsible for 72% of all such warehouse clubs. Milk, Dean Foods and the Dairy Farmers of America account for the processing of 90% of the milk in the United States. Eyeglasses, Luxottica, 60%. Meats, there are 4 companies who basically take care of meat getting to the market. Hospitals, 3 major companies, they have 77% of the market. Glass, Corning company, 60% of all the glass that's made. Appliances. In 2006, Whirlpool bought up Maytag, and 80% of all appliances now come out of Whirlpool. I have a friend that lived in a town just outside of Des Moines, Iowa, where there was a Maytag plant. It got shut down in 2006 and just, it destroyed the town. I got a lot of this information here from the website that you see below. You can just type in monopolies in the United States and get information or confirm this information if you wish. Second, loans will create debt, and that debt will have to be paid back by future generations. This was another of Jefferson's arguments. National debt was paid off once in our history. It was under Andrew Jackson, and it was followed by an economic depression. There are some economists who make the argument that deficit spending by the federal government helps to balance the economy overall. Major industries certainly are not willing to go into debt in order to level things off, etc. So the federal government does it. Plus, the military budget is gigantic, and that's a federal responsibility. Arguments about federal spending and debt still made today. There are many people in the Congress of the United States who are arguing in favor of no debt, get rid of the debt. Generally, that means social programs, does not mean military programs. These same people, however, spend billions of dollars bailing out corporations. Let's take a look at some of this. In 2020, 998 corporations received what are called bailouts. In other words, they got money from the federal government. Here's the top 10. AIG is an insurance company, $68 billion. Mostly it's banks that you can see in here. 6 of the 10 are banks. Citicorp, $45 billion. Bank of America, $45 billion. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, $25 billion each. And you can look on down the list. There's a couple of financial institutions. Chrysler Automobile Company in 2020 received $11 billion. That's a total of $635 billion in corporate bailouts in 2020. Now, some companies, these were loans, so they had to pay them back. Fact is, they really didn't need them. But if you get a $35 billion loan and you got 10 years to pay it back, you're slowly paying it back with no interest, but you're getting interest on it through savings accounts. You gain a lot of money if you get the bailout. If it's free and clear, you've got a tremendous amount of money. If it's a loan, you are going to make some money just in the interest sitting on that money during the payback period that you've agreed to. There was a Minnesota bailout of Northwest Airlines many years ago, a 10-year payback of $830 million. And Northwest Airlines said, we'll build a large facility in the north of Minnesota, employing, I think it was about 1,500 people. It never got built. the 10-year payback meant they sat on the $830 million, slowly paying it back, making interest on it. And so corporate bailouts, some payback, student loan forgiveness, a lot of arguments against this. It's given a free hand a bunch of individuals. It's $3.6 billion so far. The proposal is for an additional $4.9 billion. These are micro amounts of money compared to corporate bailouts in the United States. Jefferson argued that a national bank violated the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment talks about what the federal government can do. It's not a power granted to the federal government, according to Jefferson. Hamilton, this is Alexander Hamilton, was an opponent of Jefferson's. He wanted to see a strong federal government. And he argued that there are implied powers in the Constitution. It may not state directly what you can and can't do, but it implies certain things. And Hamilton said one of the implied powers in the Constitution is a national bank. The Fed can pass, here's what the Constitution says, quotes, laws that are necessary and proper. Pretty wide open statement. Or they can do things that are supportive of the general welfare. Again, if you take a look at that and say, well, that implies that we can pass a law on thus and such. So you can see some things sound very open-ended. They're known as elastic clauses among constitutional thinkers. Here's some implied powers in the Constitution. Declare war. It says directly you can declare war. No, it says Congress can. Presidents have been doing it since the beginning of World War II. I mean, the last congressionally declared war that we've had in the United States was World War II, and we've had many wars in roughly 75 years since the end of World War II. Some people are now arguing that, well, Congress says, okay, here's money you can spend on that war that you started, Mr. President. So people say, as long as Congress says you can spend money on it, that's a declaration of war. Implied powers of the Congress, they can levy taxes, but not on income. Constitution says you cannot have a direct tax on the people. Well, we changed that with a constitutional amendment, and the income tax started in 1913. Under William Howard Taft, it was passed, and then they said, okay, if enough states accept this and it becomes an amendment to the Constitution, which it did, then we'll start doing this in 1913. So there was a couple years wait after the passage of an income tax bill by Congress and enough states approving of it as an amendment. You can regulate commerce. Well, does that apply to a national bank? A national bank can regulate commerce. It can give loans, etc. Another implied power is you can mint currency, but how much can you mint? It's never talked about. You can control immigration, to what extent, etc. Establish bankruptcy legislation. You can punish counterfeiters of money, and you can create a national post office. And that's a biggie. We've had a post office. A big advocate of that was Benjamin Franklin. However, under Richard Nixon, we sold the post office to private investors. total of $2 billion worth of stock. The sole selling agent was Nixon's former law firm in New York City. They got 10% of the sales, which was $200 million. The post office today is a private corporation. Beginning in 1972, the stocks got sold. The federal government said, every year for the next 10 years, we're going to be reducing by 10% the amount of money that the federal government gives to the post office. In 1982, the post office received no more federal money and hasn't since. So the post office, at any rate, is indeed a private company, private corporation. Jefferson spent 8 years as president. He never got the national bank shut down. That wasn't done until Andrew Jackson in 1833. The photo here is the National Bank building in Washington, D.C. And this is where the National Bank was housed from 1789 until 1833, a period of 44 years. Jackson believed in a rural lifestyle. Of course, this didn't include himself. He was a big plantation owner who managed a rural lifestyle. Small farmers distrusted banks. Rural areas today, this is still a common thing you'll hear among farmers talking, is whether or not you can trust the bank, the local bank, and what should we do with our money? Most have their money in banks, but they have concerns. General items from the Jefferson presidency. Jefferson invented 5 major items. The first one we're going to talk about is the swivel chair. Here's a picture of the Jefferson design of a swivel chair. The chair I'm sitting in right now swivels. See me swiveling, and thank you, Tommy Jefferson. However, his desk is pretty small. My desk is a lot bigger than that. But you can see you could sit at a desk like that and write something. And rather than have to push your chair back, you could simply turn in it, stand up, come back, sit down, turn in it, and be facing your work again. It was based on the Lazy Susan, which was invented in the 1200s in China. So it was swiveling was around a long time before Jefferson. It's kind of it's considered a very unfortunate name in female history because it's got lazy in it and then a female name, Lazy Susan. It's now called the dumbwaiter, which if you're a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant, it's kind of an equally unfortunate sound. Swivel chair, it's basically a swivel chair without legs and without a back, and it revolves. And it was used, you put food on it, on a table, and you can turn it, get around to the bowl facing you of the food that you would like to dish up onto your plate. So the common use is for dining. Today, they have specialized trays that contain different items in each one. It's a more secure operation. It's not some plates sitting on a swivel. So it's still, you can still purchase these things. They're still in reasonably common usage. He invented a writing machine. Everything was handwritten. wasn't up until the 1880s that we had typewriters. So all throughout Jefferson's life, all the letters, and he created many, many letters, they were handwritten, and he frequently did the handwriting of them, almost always. And he said, now I don't have any information in my files about what I wrote to a person. So he invented this device here, which he can hold the pen on the left and write on that sheet of paper, and it controls the pen on the right and gives him a copy that he can keep for himself. So it's a two-sheet item. However, he expanded that to up to 6. He could make up to 6 copies with the machine similar to this. And the nice thing about that was he could send the same letter to 5 different people and then have a copy of his own also. And he could not write in the name and address of anyone. He could just write the body of the letter, then remove the 5 copies and write in separate names and addresses. He invented a pedometer, pictured here. The wristwatch was not invented until 1868. So this was not something you wore around your wrist, but rather you attached it to your belt line. And then you could walk and it would measure how many steps you'd taken during the course of a day or a week, whatever you used to measure your steps with concerning time. He also invented the mold board plow, pictured here. Now, a lot of plows were just straight on. They dig down into the ground, loosen the soil a bit. But this was curved and it would actually flip the dirt up and over. So you'd get a more complete mixing of the soil. Here's a farmer with a couple horses, and he's got a mold board plow on the back end. And you can see down here how it really turns over it doesn't just scrape the surface. It really turns over soil. General items, we're going to talk about eating next. Jefferson loved big fancy meals. He spent time in France as a diplomat when the United States was fighting England and later on also. And he loved the wines there, and he super liked the way they cooked food. So when he came back to the United States, he convinced a French chef to come with him, and the man worked at Monticello for many years. In Jefferson's day, turkey cost 75 cents, and a whole hog was $3. Now, keep that in mind when we talk about, he kept very good records. He spent about $50 a day on food, and he wasn't feeding slaves with that. This was guests and household workers. Turkey cost 75 cents in Jefferson's day. Today it's $1.70 a pound. A 12-pound turkey could cost about $40. That's not right. I think it'd be more like about $20. A whole hog was $3, and today it's $3 a pound. Now, roughly a 300-pound hog, you get about 210 pounds of meat. That's about $630 that the selling price on a whole hog today, whereas in Jefferson's day, it was $3. He spent $11,000 a year on wine. and he liked French wines. He'd have it shipped to the United States. In 2020, a bottle of French wine, if you purchase it in France where they don't have huge taxes on it, it'd be about $4 a bottle. In Jefferson's day, that's about 2,750 bottles in 2020 prices. That's about 7.5 bottles a day. We're going to talk more about people visiting Jefferson and how costly that was, although that was fine with Jefferson. I have a wine book that I wrote. It came out in 1979, and it's a timeless wine book. You know, it's not, hey, visit this winery today. Here's how their wine is over the last 10 years. It's about wine etiquette. Why does a wine glass have a stem, such as in this picture? Stuff like that. Want an electronic copy of it? It's been out of print, of course, came out in 79. And if you'd like an electronic copy, I can send that to you. Just write to me at jb1717@comcast.net. And if you, so anyway, JB, small case, 1717@comcast.net. So dining room table. Jefferson always had round tables. Nobody then sat in a place of prominence. You were in a circle. You didn't have a long, narrow table with a head of the table where someone would sit and they'd be in this position of, hey, I'm in control of what goes on here. Anytime I had an office with a desk in it, I always put my desk against the wall. Then when someone came in, I could turn and I'd be facing them in an open chair. They'd be sitting in an open chair. Lots of people would put the desk in the middle of the room, sit behind it. People come into your office and you got this nice barrier between you and the person visiting you. So round table, Jefferson made round tables simply because he did not want a place of prominence for dining, for meetings, etc. Jefferson, he's in conflict with Adams and Hamilton. And the topics here are commercial and urban in nature. The Federalists. Now, this is John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They were very liberal. They believed in a strong federal government, and that was considered liberal. They also, unlike Jefferson, supported the rise of industries. During the late 1700s in England, the Industrial Revolution was occurring. We really put a squelch on a lot of that rise of industries. Our big industrial advancement period was after the Civil War, like 1865 to 1900. So we were about 100 years behind England, although we had industries, but nothing like the kind of growth of industry that we saw in European countries. So the Democrats now under Jefferson, these are the conservatives. It wasn't until later on in our history that Democrats became the liberal party. Well, the Democrats and Jefferson, they opposed this industrial growth. 4 major reasons why. People have to remain close to the earth. It's the earth that makes us what we are. As soon as we lose agricultural ties, there's going to be trouble, according to Jefferson. Independent farmers, they own stuff. They get to work on their own. They get to determine their schedules. They've got control. In an industry, you are controlled. That's anti-democracy. So we got to maintain these rural areas, and we need to maintain a farming economy in order to maintain democracy. So rural lifestyle, necessary to the maintenance of democracy. And it includes not just farming a field, it also includes husbanding animals, such as we see in this photo here. Industrialization, that would increase the size of cities. You'd have a growth in urban centers. That's exactly what's happening in England and throughout Europe. We got to stop that, slow that down. Don't let it happen. That's going to mean a whole different kind of government, and it's going to be a tremendous challenge to freedom and democracy, according to Jefferson and the Democrats. Jefferson and the Democrats won this argument. It held sway for nearly 100 years, and through most of, or much of U.S. history, at least through the 1800s. So conservatives, no. Here's an interesting logo I found for conservatives, and it's got a tree logo on it. So Democrats under Jefferson. Industrialization, as I stated, occurred during the last third of the 19th century. Here's an excellent book about this period of time. Late 19th Century American Development by Jeffrey G. Williamson. It's a Cambridge University Press in England, but he taught at the University of Wisconsin. And basically what he said was railroads got built like crazy. Abraham Lincoln passed a bill that basically the federal government paid for the building of railroads. That was in 1862. And that led to a tremendous amount of transportation, far more rapidly than hauling things by horse and cart to the nearest city, what extra agricultural products you had at any rate. And well, now Williamson's writing this book and computers have come out. We have lots of statistics for economic growth from 1865 to 1900. He programmed all that into a computer. And he ran the program then. He found it was off by about 2%. He made some adjustments, got the economic growth of that period of time tied in very nicely. And the major thing that historians were talking about through much of the 20th century was how the railroad led to economic development. It's what made things happen. The speedier delivery of goods. My wife grew up outside of St. James, Minnesota, about 10 miles south on a farm, and they had a neighbor whose her brother, or this neighbor's brother, was John Holt, famous historian of the railroads. And my wife's mother asked me once, "Have you ever heard of this guy?" Well, of course, you know, because of his writing of railroad history. Well, then Williamson got the idea that, okay, I've completed this computer program. I'm going to take the railroad out, see what happens to industrial development. So he took the railroad out of the program, ran it again, no change. Economic development, industrial development would have happened without the railroad. You're still going to get the product to market. It's just going to take longer. So interesting book. Okay, monarchy, another issue between conservatives and liberals. Amazingly, it was the liberals who liked the practices of a monarchy. They wanted democracy, but both Adams and Hamilton supported hierarchies. When Adams was president from 1890 or 1797 to 1801, he said, "You can address me as Mr. President." And there was no handshaking. You bowed. So Adams would bow to people who would come to the White House. They would bow back. It was Jefferson who made things less formal. He shook hands with people when they came in. No bowing, no calling someone Your Highness. Banks, strong or weak? Let's talk about this a little bit again. Adams, Hamilton, what are we going to do about the debts that were incurred during the Revolutionary War when we were fighting for our independence against Britain? Well, we needed banks to make loans to us so that we could fight that war. Now, how do we pay off these debts? Pay off these war debts? Here's Jefferson. Here's what he said. Banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. Business. Jefferson stated, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." So here is Jefferson talking about we don't need an aristocracy, although we had one and he was a member of it. A lot of people say the American Revolution was really between the moneyed classes of the colonies and the moneyed classes of England over control of trade. It wasn't about the true definition of a revolution, which is people rising up against their leaders, such as we had in France. King is taken to the guillotine, so's the queen, etc. It was people rising up. Here it really was the moneyed class fighting another moneyed class. Debt. Well, how are you going to build stuff without getting loans and debts? Building stuff like a nation. How about an infrastructure? How about industries that were minor in the United States, but necessary? So you got a nation being built. The infrastructure, you need canals. You need rivers that were deep enough. You'd have to cut ditches in them so that certain kinds of boats could have enough water depth. And what about roads? How do you build all this stuff? Well, conservatives would say federal government doesn't do that. That's a state responsibility. So the state runs a road all the way across its state, and the next state over says, we're not going to join up with that road. So basically all you got is a road across your state. There's no interstate connections, according to the more liberal approach, who wants debts to help pay for the advancing of structure within the new United States. Jefferson, debt's a great evil. Here's a quote from Jefferson. The principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. we still hear this argument today that we're basically leaving to our children and our grandchildren a huge debt. Here's a quote. On leaving the presidency, Jefferson said, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall in shaking off the shackles of power." Third term, Jefferson considering a third term. He stated he would seek no third term. This was in keeping with George Washington's decision of serving just 2 terms. Presidents stuck with this tradition started by George Washington until we got into the 1930s, the 1940 election actually, and trials in Europe going on. Poland had been invaded by Germany in 1939. There were concerns about Germans invading other countries in Europe. And Franklin Roosevelt said, "I'm running for a third term. This is a bad time to change presidents." Ended up being elected to 4 terms, and a constitutional amendment was then passed by Republicans who didn't want a Democrat to be able to run for more than 2 terms anymore. Then they got Eisenhower elected in the 50s after the amendment is in force, that a president is limited to 2 terms or 10 years. So, for instance, Lyndon Johnson, he served the last year and a half of Kennedy's term. Then he was elected to another 4-year term. You got 4 years plus 1.5. That's 5.5. You can't serve more than 10. He could have run for another term. He chose not to. He'd had 9.5 years in after that second term, full term, had been completed. Or if you run for 2 terms, you got 8 years in, you can't run for a third term because that would put you beyond 10 years. Well, then the very popular Eisenhower comes along, could have been elected to a third term. Ronald Reagan, even though he's dead, would probably still be president. So it's kind of a shoot yourself in the foot time. There has been talk from Donald Trump about eliminating this amendment now, so that presidents can indeed serve more than 2 terms or 10 years. Future plans for Jefferson. Well, he returned to Monticello, pictured here. Jefferson loved domes, such as you see on this mansion. So he's got a big plantation, big mansion. He goes back to Virginia. He made daily horseback rides throughout his property, checking on slaves, checking on crops, looking at facilities. You know, there were lots of buildings in the plantation complex of Jefferson's, including housing for 600 slaves and housing for lots of equipment, horses and carriages, etc. And he'd have a lot more time for writing letters now. And here's a letter of Jefferson's. I've collected autographs since started in 1979. I got a $2,000 advance on that wine book. And my wife said, you know, you ought to take 10% of any money you make on a publication and buy something permanent with it. And I was in New York City, and we were visiting a friend of my wife's who worked in theater, and and had moved to New York City from this little town in southern Minnesota. And she lived on the 44th floor, and down the hallway were some people that said they'd like to meet us. And I noticed that he had a letter, handwritten letter of a French novelist. And I said, "Oh, well, isn't that interesting? Where'd you get that?" And he said, "Oh, there's half a dozen places in Manhattan where you can buy these." And so I went to one of them, and it was like a Monday, and the guy was having an auction on Thursday at the Waldorf Astoria. So I went to the auction, and I bought some letters, but Jefferson material was too expensive for me, so I don't own any Jefferson letters. I do have a signature, that's it, of Jefferson. So at any rate, Jefferson was very interested in writing letters. As you can see, they're handwritten, which makes them even more valuable. Typed letter signed, then basically all you're getting is a signature. They sell for less money than what are called autograph letters, where the person has handwritten them. Jefferson spent hours every day communicating with people, getting the letters sent off. Everything had to be handwritten. Here is, "Dear Sir, Monticello, July 24, 25. He doesn't put a year in there. Very thankful to the Bunker Hill Monument Association for the honor they have done me in electing me an honorary member of that institution," and so on. Very easy to read. And note, it's cursive. Visitors that Jefferson had after his presidency. He had other people that lived near him that owned plantations, and they would frequently come and visit. They'd show up unannounced. You didn't have any way to contact people. There were no telephones, no cell phones. You wouldn't write a letter, "Hey, can we come over there 3 weeks from now?" And then the letter'd get delivered, and then it'd be sent back. And instead, you just go, "Hey, let's go visit Tommy." So you'd show up, and conversations might last for several hours. They might last over a meal time. This is why Jefferson was having large meals on a regular basis. A neighbor might come with someone who was visiting them from another state. All of us, and they bring their wives and a few kids, and bang, you got 10 people for supper. Now, sometimes you didn't know these visitors. They weren't a neighbor. They were just somebody, "Hey, we've heard of you. We know you were president. We wanted to see your place." Well, then you're obligated. They show up unannounced, and they may have come from some distance. So Monticello had several bedrooms, so you could put people up. And again, this accounts for the tremendous amount of food that would be fed to people who would just say, "Let's go visit President Jefferson." University of Virginia. Jefferson wanted a university. He wanted it run by the state, and he wanted it to have 5 elements, and he was the founder of it. This is a picture today here, a photograph of the University of Virginia. And this is the library here. And notice the dome, Jefferson characteristic. Jefferson wanted no religious influences in this university that he was founding. And he put the library at the center of it, not a church. Churches were frequently at the center of towns. They were at the center of private colleges and universities. Jefferson said, "No churches. Library is what it's about." So the library was at the center. and it's a rotunda, as you see here. It's a dome. This is a very popular design. Jefferson was the architect of this building. It was a popular design because the Greeks had domes, ancient Greeks did, and they were a celebrated culture. Here's the interior of the library that Jefferson designed. You can do research here. Look at this guy. Get your feet off the chair. And you can see people doing research here. Here are people sitting back in these areas and doing research. And this is a more modern picture, as you can see. People are wearing that kind of dress. In 1895, the library burned, but students ran inside and grabbed a statue of Jefferson, which was in there, and hauled it out. The building was restored. It's still on the campus to this day. He wanted education at this university to be free. All education should be public and it should be free. You shouldn't have to pay for it. And anybody can attend. It doesn't make any difference what your income level is. Schools like Harvard and Yale were created for children of the upper classes. The University of Virginia was created by Jefferson for anyone, no matter what their status, to attend. And housing was also provided free, both for the faculty and for the students who were in attendance there. He chose the property where the university would be built. And here's a kind of map of it today. Look at it here. Football stadium. Yeah, these sports didn't exist when Jefferson was president. At any rate, Jefferson considered this his greatest accomplishment, was a free university. He chose the property, as I'd said. The institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. And Jefferson saw religion as a limit to that goal. He designed all the buildings in the main mall area of the University of Virginia. And it's in keeping with this ancient Greek design. There's an area like this at the University of Minnesota, the mall area. It's got student classroom buildings and a library. A library is, sits like in this area, not here. This is a big auditorium, Northrop Auditorium, at the end of the mall area at the University of Minnesota. And fifth, curriculum requirements are going to be, we need to maintain an agricultural society. So you teach people to do things. They may have to live in a city to do what they're doing, but the purpose of what they're doing and the purpose of their education is to maintain an agricultural society, according to Jefferson. Difficulties with John Adams. They did not like each other at all. These difficulties get resolved. 1790s, both Jefferson and Adams had separated, both socially, politically. They'd had no contact with each other for an extended period of time. Issues that separated them: weak versus strong federal government, lifestyle issues. Adams was a big family values guy. Jefferson maintained a tremendous amount of debt throughout his life. They had not communicated for many years, and this is the man that got them writing to each other again. He's Benjamin Rush. He's a founding father, spoke to each of them separately. Finally, Adams decided he would write a letter to Jefferson, which he did. They started communicating again in 1812 and ended with their deaths. They both died on the same day of the same year, hours apart. So for 14 years now, they wrote letters, whopping amount of letters, 158 letters. That's about one letter a month for 14 years. You can buy a book that contains these letters that they were writing to each other. The Adams-Jefferson letters, complete correspondence. Here on the left is a letter in the handwriting of John Adams, and you can see the black arrow points to, he's writing from Quincy. That's a town in Massachusetts. On the right is a Jefferson letter to John Adams, and you can see its location is written in Monticello. The Marquis de Lafayette. This is the Marquis de Lafayette during the American Revolution. He was on loan to the United States from France. He was a military general. He aided us in the American Revolution. The reason the French wanted to do this is England was their traditional enemy, and here you got a group of colonies rising up against England, so France sends help. It was actually the French that won this war for us. They sent lots of ships over here, and they were able to blockade Yorktown Harbor in 1781, and the British could not escape the land forces and were forced to surrender as a result of the French blockade. Lafayette was invited back to the United States. He'd left in 1789 when the Constitution was adopted, went back to France. Now it's 1824, 35 years later, and he comes back to visit. There was no Washington, D.C. when he had been here during the American Revolution and beyond. So he visited Washington, D.C., which had now been built. And he visited New York City, and then he went to Monticello and spent 11 days with Jefferson. Jefferson positions. Slavery. Let's take a look at it. We've talked a lot about slavery, but Jefferson, but we're going to keep talking, I guess. Jefferson was a slave owner. The United States was divided on the issue. It was North versus South, just as during the Civil War. Slave ownership. At the age of 21, Jefferson owned 41 slaves. He eventually inherited 175 more. He's up to about 230 just births and additional purchases. 370 more are added with these births over the course of his lifetime, to it where at one point he owned as many as 600 slaves. He purchased some slaves. Almost always when he bought slaves, it was to reunite families. So that sounds like a great thing. He wasn't trying to separate families. The tremendous debt that he accrued over the course of his lifetime, several times he had to pay it off. So he didn't always own 600 slaves. At one point, he sold 110 slaves just to pay off the debt that he had. Treatment of slaves, his position on that. He spoke and wrote about all slaves should be treated well. He wrote about and indeed gave every Sunday off. Slaves didn't have to work on Sundays, and they got every Christmas off, which wasn't much of a benefit in those years when Christmas fell on a Sunday. Many wrote, however, there's diary entries. They would visit Jefferson, and there were slaves being brutally treated, whipped. They were bound with chains. There were records were kept by Jefferson overseers about the number of whippings at Monticello. So it's one thing to talk nice, another thing, what's the practice? Jefferson thought slaves were just incapable of managing freedom. People of color cannot manage freedom. He stated slavery's evil, but let's not keep them here. We need to send them back to Africa. We can do this slowly. And at the same time, he said that's probably pretty much an impossible plan. The cost of it alone would be staggering. As president, he was quiet on the issue. He didn't want to cause trouble. There was already too much tension between the North and the South. President talking about slavery and what to do about it, and the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves would have just caused too much trouble. Saw radical wars as a possibility. I mean, racial wars as a possibility if there was too much talk about slavery and about freedom. And these photos are from recent times. White lives matter, and white supremacy is terrorism. So to some extent, still an issue today, especially South and Central American immigration, unwanted immigration. Theory of rising expectations. This is from sociologists. If you keep a group of people down, the odds of them rising up are minimal. Revolutions don't happen when people are being treated very poorly, such as was happening on Jefferson's plantation. It's when they start hearing about hope, and this is why Jefferson stayed silent. It's when people start hearing about the possibility of freedom or making more money in wages. That's when revolutions occur. It's also interesting just what words we use. Was the civil rights movement full of riots or protests? In the Middle Eastern wars today, we hear about one side talking about their people captured by their enemies, their hostages, but the people we captured from their side are prisoners. So Jefferson didn't talk much about slavery, especially the freeing of slaves. So what? Slaves at Monticello. What do they do there? Well, this is a surprise. It's not agriculture. Guess what? It was industry. It was nails. Not fingernails, but nails like this. This is where Jefferson made most of his money. He had slaves making nails. Job was done in large part by children. You'd take, this is just a piece of steel, a long, narrow piece of steel, and you'd cut it to a certain length. And then you'd heat it and pound it, and the children would do the pounding here. They would pound it to a point at one end. Then there was a blacksmith who would attach a head to it. This was Jefferson's major source of income, not agriculture, which he regularly said we must maintain or we'll lose our democracy. The major business at Mount Vernon under George Washington was whiskey. It was a distillery. It was not an agricultural place, although, of course, you needed grains to make the whiskey. Slavery, legislative record. We're going to go slow. Jefferson stated he wanted a slow, gradual end to slavery. This has been an argument throughout history. In the 1960s, people were saying, hey, we slow down. We're moving too fast here. This whole civil rights movement, okay, I favor it, but it's going to take some time. Argument was made in the 1960s with civil rights. It was made during the women's movement, continues to this day. In Jefferson's case of slowness, his major argument was these people cannot adjust to freedom. So you got to go very slow. After emancipation, 1865, many whites saw to it that it would take decades. The Ku Klux Klan was created. We went through 90 more years until Lyndon Johnson started passing all sorts of legislation about where blacks could be seen and what they could say and so on. It's really within the lifetimes of almost all of us that are on this lecture today that things really started to open up. 5 proposals for slavery. Train slaves for resettlement. And we got to get them out of the areas they're in now, send them to areas that are non-slave areas. And it's like Florida and Texas have put Central American and South American immigrants on buses, sent literally hundreds of them into New York City and into other northern areas. And this was being done during the civil rights movement too. Many areas in the South put people of color onto buses and sent them. One bus was sent to Worthington, Minnesota, who didn't send them back as most areas did. Worthington said, okay, we'll make some housing for you and find some jobs, etc. Virginia prohibited the freeing of slaves. Jefferson asked that this be stopped. I ought to be able to free slaves if I want to. Like he had children who were born slaves, for instance. Western U.S. territories, like the Northwest Territory, which included Minnesota, it went from Ohio to Minnesota. That should be slave free and was, but Louisiana Territory wasn't. So ban the international slave trade was a concern in the 1780s, and it was stopped with legislation in 1807 that took effect on January 1st of 1808. Slavery was banned by the federal Congress in the states that you see here. Here's a chunk of Minnesota. This is the Northwest Territory. It's everything north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. Jefferson allowed slavery in the Louisiana Territory. So Louisiana would be a place to send rebellious slaves, that Louisiana Territory. You got slaves causing a lot of trouble, get them out of here. Get them into a place that's not a part of the United States, it's a territory. And this will stop revolts in places where white folks live, like Virginia and South Carolina. So the slave trade stopped 1808. This is a benefit to Jefferson. You can't bring slaves in anymore from Africa. Big slaveholders now are the only way anyone else can get a slave. You have to buy it from these large slave owners. So basically you're in the business of keeping the female slaves pregnant. Fourth item, legislative record. The original copy of the Declaration of Independence that was written by Jefferson stated that George III had forced slavery on the colonies. And this was done in 1776. Southerners edited that out. They didn't want the king being blamed. So Jefferson basically didn't want to take the blame. Here's the state of Missouri within the U.S., and it wanted statehood, and it said that it would be willing to ban slavery. So if you make us a state, we will free all slaves when they hit the age of 25 years old. Jefferson argued against this requirement, said it would destroy the Union. We need to have slave states coming in with free states. It would lead to fighting between free and slave states. And so Missouri's granted statehood in 1821, but as a slave state. I lived there in the 1960s during the civil rights movement for 3 years. And believe me, you know, it was a slave state at one time. How are we doing for questions? Let me take a quick look.
It's 1:47 right now, so we have about less than 15 minutes until 2.
Okay, let me get this finished.
Okay, we only have 6 questions so far, so.
6. Oh, well,
but there might be more questions coming in.
Yeah, let me do a couple more minutes here. And,
okay.
The Jefferson Foundation. Many historians, Jefferson was an opponent of slavery throughout his life. They say that. That's an interpretation, and that's been kind of standard comments about Jefferson. Now, since the 1960s, many say he said one thing, but he did another thing. So he was claiming to have moral standards, but his actions did not display that. This is known as hypocrisy. The revisionist school of in historical interpretation. Many people think revisionist school, well, that means something's false. No, it doesn't. It's a new school of historical interpretation. Study of historical interpretation is called historiography. So as a side note, I'd say when we meet next week, we could talk in more detail about historiography. Maybe I'll take time to run through this real quick. Well, no. Let's see how we do with the questions, and we'll start with next week, what is historiography? And I'll have about 150 slides and we'll finish up next week. So let's, I need to, there, thanks.
All right. How would Jefferson have dealt with succession had he been president instead of Lincoln? Would he have had a civil war, or would the South have been become a separate country?
How would Jefferson have dealt with? Oh, do they mean secession or no?
Succession, yes.
Succession of
basically, like if Jefferson was in Lincoln's position, would he have let this? Would he have gone through the Civil War like to keep unity, or would he have let the South be a separate country?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a difficult thing to talk about, but I mean to define. You just really don't know. You got you got a 60-year difference between Jefferson and Lincoln. The whole anti-slavery movement had begun to get a whole lot more support. Um, I don't know. If you just dump Jefferson into the Civil War era period or the early 1860s, he would have wanted to maintain slavery. I guess I'd be pretty certain of that. So uh, I think I think there probably would have still been a war. Yeah.
Okay. Um, what was the status of Sally Hemings when he returned to the US?
Actually, Jefferson's daughter came to France to live with him when he was a diplomat there, and she brought her slave maid with her, and that slave maid was Sally Hemings. That's how Jefferson and Hemings began a very long-term relationship of a sexual nature. And and then when they came back to the U.S., they maintained and continued that. Jefferson's wife had asked him not to remarry. Jefferson's wife had had a couple of stepmothers. Her mother had died, and then her father remarried twice. Second wife died, and she had a horrible time with these stepmothers. And so she was concerned that her children with Jefferson would have a difficult time with stepmothers also. So Jefferson agreed he wouldn't remarry, he wouldn't allow her or their children to have stepmothers. And consequently, he had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings.
All right. So here's the next question. How was the university financed?
There were different taxes. You couldn't have an income tax, but they would tax alcohol, for instance. They would tax property, etc. So the state of Virginia would bring in some non-income tax uh, revenue, and that would support the university. Of course, you didn't have to worry about large university populations. University of Minnesota currently has 6,500 students, populate or 65,000 students. The University of Virginia at this time was very small. The population of Virginia was small. So, yeah, done.
All right. How many children of any partner did Jefferson have? Did he have a happy home?
Yeah. He had Sally Hemings living in Monticello. She had a special room near his bedroom. He had 6 children with her. 3 of them were able to pass as white and moved to Wisconsin. And some of them got educated even. Um, and as far as we know, that was the extent of Jefferson's relationships with the woman was with Sally Hemings. It was a long-term relationship. Whether she was a loving partner or not, of course, we'll never know. So,
All right. Someone made a comment, the UV library reminds me of the Pantheon in Rome, Neo-Grecian classical architecture.
Oh, yeah. A lot of Roman architecture is also based on Greek architecture, especially the domes. So yes, they shared common designs.
Okay. Um, and I'm trying to I don't quite understand the question. I think what they're trying to say is, why is this presentation about Jefferson?
Hmm.
The
Yeah, I
question
don't,
the question says, why does this about Jefferson?
yeah, I don't know what that means.
No.
Well, listen, Nancy, submit the question again next week, I guess, or feel free to email me and I'll answer it for next week. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. What was Jefferson's view of the Native Americans compared to slaves at the time?
He thought Native Americans were perfectly capable of leading an agricultural life. He thought they were super people. He thought they could integrate very well with Europeans and a very, very different attitude than he had about Africans. Yeah.
Okay. We just got another question in, but I think we should just wrap it up with these two questions.
Okay.
Sound okay? Okay,
Yes.
because I think the last one will be a little bit more involved. So, was walking important to Jefferson as he created the pedometer?
Oh, yeah, I apparently it must have been, but I don't know anything about that. But the fact that he created it, frequently these things were very much like the round table, etc., were reflective of things Jefferson wanted. So yeah, I would expect that he didn't just horseback ride around his plantation, although it was huge, but he could walk to different areas also. And he would go to the area where the University of Virginia was being built, and he could walk around there and maybe spend a month at the site, etc. So yeah, I personal use certainly had to be a major benefit of that. So,
Okay. The last question we have is, which of the first three presidents would you most enjoy spending the evening with, and why? So I think that,
well, yeah, well, Jefferson would be interesting to talk to if you didn't talk to him about his presidency. I mean, look at the stuff this guy accomplished. It's amazing, and we'll talk next week about Jefferson accomplishments. However, I'd want to talk to all three of them. I think George Washington might be the least interesting. He was the least talkative, and he was. I think he saw himself as a military person to a large extent, whereas Adams and Jefferson did not. Um, Adams would be difficult, I think. Sit and talk to John Adams, I think he'd be a bit on the difficult side. He was kind of sanctimonious. Um, he had didn't shake hands, he bowed, etc. So I think Washington and Adams might be more difficult, but I'd want to talk to them. I think Jefferson, uh, the amount of letters that he wrote, the people he was in contact with, the sorts of things he invented, he'd probably be able to discuss things with you. The major problem for Jefferson is he had a stutter. He didn't like to talk much. So,
so
end
maybe a pen pal.
of story.
All right. Well, thank you very much for I think that's all the questions. And do you have any final remarks?
No. See you next week, final episode.